I'm Charmaine Cozier. Each week, 4 expert witnesses, 1 question and an answer. January 2023, Japan. Parents in the Tokyo region receive an offer it's hoped they won't refuse. In return for moving their young families out of urban areas, they could get 1 million yen per child. That's just over $7,000. The cash does come with conditions. At least one family member must have a job or be planning to start a business in their new rural location. If they quit before 5 years is up, they have to pay everything back. It's the latest in a series of local and central government initiatives to tackle an intriguing property problem. So this week we're asking, why are there millions of empty houses in Japan?
Part 1. IKEA.
In Japanese, vacant houses is akiya. Aki means vacant or empty. Ya means house. My name is Ayumi Sugimoto. I am Associate Professor at Akita International University. Almost every day, when I go to my office, when I drive my car, I can observe several Akiya empty houses on the way. So sometimes I can easily identify this is Akiya empty house because glasses are blowing higher, or glass windows or doors or roofs are already broken. So such bad condition of Akiya could be easily identified.
Akita Prefecture, where Ayumi Sugimoto lives, has one of the highest concentrations of empty houses in Japan. The number there has been growing for years.
According to 2018 national statistics, the number of Akiya empty houses was 60,800, an increase of 4,200 over the past 5 years. The empty house rate was 13.6%, and this ratio is exactly the same as Japan's whole empty house rate.
It's important to note that not all IKEA are in poor condition, so can be difficult to spot. They also exist in urban areas. Official figures identify more than 8 million abandoned homes across Japan, so it's likely the actual number exceeds that. There are several reasons for the empty private property glut. One is financial.
The tax system is also a very important factor why Japan has so many IKEA right now. Because the land on which a house stands is subject to preferential measures such as 1/6 reduction in property tax. This is believed to be one of the reasons why all the vacant houses IKEA are not demolished but left unattended.
Because if the property disappears, so does the tax relief, meaning there's more to pay.
So keeping their houses as IKEA empty house is less cost for the owners in terms of tax payment.
Another key reason is spiritual. Homes which have been in families for hundreds of years have too many memories to be torn down or sold on when the last descendants depart.
Inside empty house, sometimes people just keep their ancestors' Buddhism altar, so their ancestors' spirits still stay at their home. This is one of the reasons why owners do not want to destroy their house and clean the land.
Employment also plays a part. The economy in Akita leans towards traditional industries like rice production and brewing sake.
There is not so many job opportunities or education opportunities, especially the higher education. So many young generations now move to big cities like Tokyo, Sendai or Osaka.
Older generations also leave homes behind to move closer to relatives or specialist healthcare. Neglected IKEA pose a risk to nearby properties and people. They can attract animals like wild bears. The large traditional wooden houses can also be dangerous when the weather changes.
So Akita is located in the northern part of Japan. We have a lot of heavy snow during the winter season. So that time, IKEA is very old houses. It sometimes collapses when the spring comes. So it's a very huge impact for their neighbors' quality of life.
District administrations trying to fix that face challenges, like people moving without leaving a forwarding address.
Municipal government have to receive agreement or permission from the house owners when they try to destroy the houses and clean the land. But sometimes they cannot identify who are the actual owners, or their neighbors also do not know who is the actual owner and where they are now.
There's also disagreements over spending public money on a problem caused by private ownership.
So here is the conflict between the local communities, government, and private owners.
Relocation schemes in other parts of Japan have seen vacant homes repaired and repurposed as cafes, farm shops, craft workshops and tourist accommodation.
But the reality is there are more and more IKEAs than people's needs. Okay, I would like to renovate IKEA to start my new business in rural area or urban area. There are some motivation and needs, but reality is there are more and more old IKEAs that is already too old to utilize or to renovate. So the community shrinkage is remarkable, especially in rural community in Akita.
Part 2. The people problem.
So in Japan, population aging started in 1970 when the proportion of older people aged 65 plus in the total population hit 7%. Now Japan is a super age society with almost 30% of its populations are 65 and older.
Misa Izuhara is a professor of social policy at the University of Bristol in the UK.
Japanese people live longer, so life expectancy is nearly 88 years for women and 81 for men. So this is, I must say, is really a good news, thanks to advanced healthcare, social security, education and technology and so on.
The number of people living for longer continues to rise. At the other end of the age scale, however, it's a very different story.
The current fertility rate, that is the number of babies which women in the reproductive age on average have, is 1.3, which is well below the population replacement rate of 2.1. So this has been an issue for many years since the second baby boom in the early 1970s. The population peaked at 128 million in 2010 and started declining. And it is predicted to decline by 32% down to 87 million by the year 2060.
Earlier this year, in a speech to lawmakers, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said reversing the low birth rate simply cannot wait any longer because the country was edging closer to not being able to function as a society if it failed to improve.
It's really unusual for a couple to have children without being married. So marriage rate has declined significantly, and it's kind of part of the explanation for low fertility.
So what does all of this have to do with empty homes? Well, population patterns are partly responsible for upending traditional living arrangements.
3-generation co-residency was common in the past, before family nuclearization started in the post-war period. So typically, older parents lived with their eldest son and his family, which helped the generations share their household resources and finance, providing support to each other, and also made family succession easier, including passing on their family residence.
That changed after the end of the Second World War, when Japan entered an era known as the economic miracle.
In the economic growth period, many young people, for example, moved to larger cities for employment and subsequently established their own household there.
So houses previously lived in by generations of the same family gradually slid into disrepair.
The older generation has become wealthier with their own income, their own social security like pensions. So co-residency was a mode of survival, if you like, when resources were scarce. So once they can afford, both generations want to live separately.
Fast forward to now, and the traditional family setup continues to decline.
Household size is getting smaller, and that has housing implications. For example, in 1970, approximately a half of households were married couples with children, and 14% were three-generation household. But now, there has been a significant expansion of smaller household with just one or two people. So single-person households are the most common type of household now, and about 38% of the total household.
When those sole occupiers move or pass away, another IKEA is created.
I want to promote more sharing or more collaborative way of living or different way to consume housing.
But would there be an appetite for that in Japan?
It needs cultural shift. So there is appetite, but it's very niche at the moment. There are different initiatives providing new houses for young people to share. But the use of the old housing stock is something that a lot more thought needs to go into. And I think it will take time to change the way people live in Japan. I would definitely say this empty housing syndrome is problematic. But I think demographic change is not the only reason for the dramatic increase in empty houses.
In 2011, the Fukushima nuclear power plant on the east coast of Japan was struck by a tsunami. It triggered the world's worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl.
We are in a nuclear emergency!
Fukushima, a new audio drama series from the BBC World Service, tells the story of how the disaster unfolded and of those living with its aftermath.
The radiation is here. It's everywhere.
Search for Fukushima wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Part 3. Supply and demand.
Old homes are the priority demand in some countries, but not in Japan.
Majority of Japanese people, regardless of generation, prefer modern houses to traditional houses. And this is not least because people have the general idea that all the houses, especially those built right after the Second World War, were poorly constructed.
Kazuki Morimoto is an associate professor in Japanese at the University of Leeds in the UK. In some countries, buyers compete to pay premium prices for old properties. Not in Japan.
Japanese people often say your house will not be worth anything in 30 years' time, even if you have bought a brand new house.
That's because Japan is prone to natural events like earthquakes and typhoons. It has strict building codes to ensure structures are as sound as possible in order to minimise damage. Those rules and regulations also apply to other measures like energy efficiency. They're updated every 10 years, so homes built before the most recent amendments won't be compliant, unless owners spend a lot of money to bring them up to the new standards. Many don't do that, so those homes plummet in value.
The newer house tend to be more expensive, just like here in the UK, but the building companies are very good at marketing and in terms of what houses are affordable among the people. And so they build according to the needs.
And those needs are changing the housing landscape in a country where more than 800,000 new homes are built every year.
Sometimes I'm quite surprised to see, how many tiny small houses are built in a small site when all the house was demolished. The Japanese government has invested heavily in the house sectors through tax incentives and financial support for both builders and buyers.
Those intense efforts on the new housing front are happening alongside financial incentives to occupy older, empty homes.
Yes, that's very complicated because on one hand, the government is trying to encourage the people to renovate all the houses and solve the problem of abandoned houses. But at the same time, the government is also encouraging people to buy newer houses, which tend to be expensive to boost the economy in a wider context.
The population shift sparked by the rural exodus is piling additional pressures onto big cities.
People are always talking about the decreasing population in Japan, which is true. But it is not so straightforward in the context of housing, because although the population itself is certainly decreasing, the number of households, particularly in Tokyo, have been steadily increased. And that's because more and more people now live alone, and even in like rural areas or like small cities, still the number of households are increasing. And so people are saying that kind of supply and demand, the balance is getting wrong.
That mismatch means homes are hard to find in certain areas.
In some parts of big cities like Tokyo, Osaka, in a popular area, there is certainly house shortages, particularly for affordable houses. If you go to suburban areas, then there are more supplies than needed.
There are also financial knock-on effects for public services in some of the regions people are migrating from, which could result in even more leaving.
Yeah, definitely. That's the major concerns the local government, local authorities, and the government is having, because more and more people are moving from smaller cities into big cities. And then only older people remain in rural areas. So in terms of the tax incomes, it doesn't seem to be sustainable for like infrastructures and then healthcare services in some rural areas. The fundamental thing is that the Japanese people prefer newer homes because they believe it saves money and then safer to live than older houses. Unless the government really enforce more like a drastic measure, it's very difficult to change the situation.
Part 4. Moving on.
Jiro Yoshida is an associate professor of business at Pennsylvania State University in the US. He's also a guest professor of economics at the University of Tokyo.
I was born in a rural city called Morioka in Japan, and I lived in Tokyo for 15 years.
Japan's housing situation has a distinct combination of factors which include overwhelming preference for new builds. Homes also lose value over time. That means it's not directly comparable to other countries, but there is some common ground.
Japan has a really high vacancy rate for housing. But also, there are some other countries that have high vacancy rates as well. For example, the United States also accumulated a huge amount of housing stock. So aggregate vacancy rate in the US is about 12 to 13% as well. Other countries that have high vacancy rates include Spain and Greece and other European countries as well. So definitely vacant housing problems are not only unique to Japan, but that's a significant problem for many countries.
Being able to afford somewhere to live is something that potential renters and buyers everywhere can identify with. Jiro Yoshida suggests other economies might be able to bring prices down by adopting elements from the Japanese building regulations process.
First of all, it is a national building code, and there's no variation across different regions. So once you understand the code, construction companies can operate anywhere in Japan without much problem. So that helps construction companies to expand into other markets and grow as large companies. So that creates economies of scale. The cost will be reduced. So if other countries adopt Japanese model of housing supply, then I think that's good to resolve the current affordability problems in many countries.
And what's your outlook for Japan's empty home problem?
That's still a difficult problem to solve. One thing that can be done is to change tax code, especially property tax code. So currently, property taxes favor land with structures attached to it.
Keeping an empty home on land can also bring inheritance tax bills down.
Property tax exemptions for structures can be removed. then the land with the structures are treated equally, then I would expect more demolition of low quality old houses, and those land will be converted into other uses, and the property tax code change can be a one trigger for that.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, working from remote locations became the norm for many people. So to what extent could distance working utilise Japan's empty homes and stem rural to city migration?
A lot of jobs, especially service jobs or third sector jobs, are created in Tokyo area or large cities only. So young people, even if they want to live in rural areas, there aren't many jobs in rural areas. So if work from home are getting more common, then there's a hope that those young people can move to rural areas using the abundant large detached houses there and work for a company in Tokyo. That can mitigate or resolve the problem significantly.
There's also scope for a better quality of life.
Some of the new startup companies moved to rural areas and used those abundant old houses as an office. And what's nice is that they can connect to the internet through optic fiber cable. So that's a new experiment that's happening in Japan, and I have a hope for that.
However, there's a deep tradition of office culture in Japan, which means that while startup businesses might champion new ways of working, bigger established employers are unlikely to get behind that change. But a key labour shortage is looming elsewhere in Japan's workforce, and it could slow the future supply of new homes.
So construction industry tends to hire sort of middle-aged male typically. In the future, those people are going to retire and the population demographics is going to change. The construction industry cannot really maintain the current scale. Then finally, the Japanese construction industry may have to reduce its size. Then that can be a natural end of the abundant housing supply in the Japanese economy, where demand for new housing is getting smaller and smaller because of decreasing population and aging population.
So why are there millions of empty houses in Japan? There's much more to this than the fallout from a shifting, shrinking population. Reasons range from the spiritual, preserving memories of ancestors, to the practical, such as tax advantages if decaying houses are not demolished. It's also a country where homes lose value over time, so new ones are preferred. Revitalised properties are up and running with new owners, but they can only scratch at the surface of the problem, which all means the number of IKEA will continue to grow. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Charmaine Cozier, and produced by Jill Collins. The researcher was Bissi Adebayo, editor Tara McDermott, and technical producer Richard Hannaford.
The attacker had very good knowledge of banking systems.
$2.1 billion in stolen funds.
Money laundering operations.
A cyber criminal group.
These are smart guys.
Seasons 1 and 2 of The Lazarus Heist from the BBC World Service are available in full right now.
Following the twists and turns in the incredible story of the Lazarus Group hackers.
The Lazarus Heist from the BBC World Service. Catch up with the whole series now, wherever you get your BBC podcasts.